Welcome to the Social Mobility Commission's November employer event. So the building blocks of social mobility in conversation with Ann Francke OBE. So thank you for joining us today. So today's session, we will explore how your organisation can develop a social mobility strategy, what the initial steps you can take are, and how leaders in your organisation can ensure that that they're creating a culture where all employees can thrive regardless of their background. If you just look at today's session, so we've got a quick overview of our building blocks toolkit for employers. And then for the main event, I'm pleased to be joined today by Ann Francke, so Chief Executive of the Chartered Management Institute, so one of the UK's leading professional bodies for management and leadership. So we're also joined today by SMC Director, John Craven. So through our conversations with Ann and John, we'll be exploring how and what organisations should be considering when thinking about socio-economic diversity within the workforce. We'll also have a Q&A session at the end, so please do pop your questions in the chat function. So if we just move on to the next slide. So a bit of housekeeping before we start. So if you do have any questions, please pop them into the Q&A box throughout the session, and then we will endeavour to answer your questions at the Q&A session at the end. And just a note, this webinar is being recorded and will be available to watch on our website and YouTube channel after today's event. If we just move on to the next slide. So as I mentioned, so at the SMC, we've recently published our building blocks toolkit. So the toolkit provides first step guidance to help businesses and organisations of all sizes up and down the country kickstart their socio-economic diversity strategy. So it includes recommended interventions on data, culture and leadership, recruitment and outreach practices, which are all designed for organisations that are new to this and who are just getting started. We know organisations are on varying stages within their journey of social mobility and socio-economic diversity and inclusion. But we do know even the smallest businesses and those without large HR departments will be able to apply many of the recommendations and take their first steps to ensuring their organisation is an environment where all staff can thrive regardless of their background. So please do check out our toolkit, which is available and can be downloaded from our website. So if we move into the main section for this event, so it's our in conversation session. So if I just introduce our guest speakers for today's session. So I'm pleased to be joined by Ann Francke OBE. So Ann is the Chief Executive of the Chartered Management Institute. So it's one of the UK's leading professional bodies for management and leadership, with a global member community of over 180,000 members. So Ann started her career at Procter & Gamble and has held senior executive positions at Mars, Boots, Yale and BSI. So in 2020, Ann was awarded an OBE for services to workplace equality. So Ann is an expert in equality in the workplace and speaks frequently in the media and on conferences about workplace equality and also other management topics. I'm also joined today by John Craven. So John is the SMC Director. So John was appointed head of the Social Mobility Commission in June 2022. And before joining the SMC, John was the Chief Executive of the social mobility charity Outreach. John has also previously worked 11 years in investment banking and as a teacher and lead practitioner at several state and independent schools. So thank you, Anne, and thank you, John, for joining us today.
Pleasure.
So I thought I'd kick off with you, Anne. Just wanted to find out a bit more about CMI, and I know you're celebrating your 75th anniversary this year, and as part of this, you're focusing on 6 key themes, and one of the key themes is socioeconomic background. So I just wanted to find out why it was important to CMI to consider socioeconomic background alongside other protected characteristics, so race and ethnicity, and gender and disability.
Well, thank you, Edward, and delighted to be here. Thanks for inviting me. So for our 75th anniversary, we did a piece of research called the Everyone Economy, because we know from our work at CMI and many other organizations that having diverse and teams that feel genuinely included boosts outcomes for any organization, whether you're in the private or public sector. And we wanted to look across the so-called protected characteristics, and obviously race, ethnicity, gender, disability, these are protected, but we included socioeconomic background. It is actually not a protected characteristic, but of course, it doesn't mean that it isn't, that socioeconomic groups from disadvantaged backgrounds aren't marginalized in their outcomes, in their employment outcomes. And this is what our study found. Our study found that if we look across the protected characteristics, including socioeconomic background, we are missing about 420,000 managers from disadvantaged backgrounds. This is in proportion to the working population. And that's the single highest omission apart from gender. Women, there are over 500,000 female managers missing, but of course they are the majority of the population, so it's a larger group. And yet it's still not a protected characteristic. Now, as one of our 75th advisory participants said, it's because the problem with the law is that it lags, it doesn't lead. And actually, employers need to lead on this point. And it's very important as well that you consider not only socioeconomic background, but the other protected characteristics in what we call intersectionality, because oftentimes you'll have somebody from a disadvantaged background, and they may also be from a minority ethnicity or a gender or a disability. So it's very important to look at this characteristic in combination with the others. But they're definitely underrepresented in the management and leadership of our country.
Brilliant, thank you, Anne. It's very relevant as well, saying that employers should actually take the lead on this. So that kind of leads on to the next question, and it's just thinking about, so the topic for today's session is to discuss how organizations can take their first steps in considering socioeconomic background. So Anne, for you, what advice would you give to organizations when they start considering socioeconomic backgrounds? What should they be considering in their workplace?
Well, I think the first step is to recognize that there's a problem. The same research I quoted, the Everyone Economy, uncovered across the board what we're calling a say-do gap. And it's really important that employers do not fall into this trap. What's the say-do gap? Well, let's take socioeconomic background. When we ask employers and managers, is your workplace inclusive for people of disadvantaged socioeconomic backgrounds? 83% said, yes, of course we are. Of course our organization is inclusive. So then we ask them, okay, can you name an active program that you have to recruit more people and promote and progress more people from disadvantaged backgrounds? And suddenly that 83% drops to 26. So that means that very, very few can actually name a single active program that they're taking to promote greater inclusion of people from disadvantaged socioeconomic backgrounds. So the very first step employers do need to take is recognize you have a responsibility, and it goes well beyond just claiming that you're doing stuff. You actually have to, close your say-do gap and do things to encourage and include people from disadvantaged backgrounds.
Thank you, Anne. I think that statistic on the conversion rate to those who think their workforce does do something and then actively knowing what their workforce does, that's quite a stark statistic. So John, as well, to bring you in here as well, just follow up on that question. So what advice would you give to organisations starting out considering socioeconomic background?
Thank you, Edward, and good afternoon, everyone. I think Anne's made a really good business case and has highlighted the say-do gap, which I think is really, really important. I think we need to look at the context that we're in right now. We had the pandemic, which I think, as we all know, exposed and exacerbated existing inequalities in society. Coming from that, we now have a cost of living crisis, which again is impacting people from lower socioeconomic groups even worse than the rest. And there's a lot of evidence coming through now about education and how attainment gaps are widening, and how those from the less advantaged backgrounds have suffered even more during the pandemic and since. And there just isn't the funding going in to closing those gaps for reasons we know. So it really is important that employers step up to the plate and take responsibility to do even more than before. Employers play a really vital role, and they directly influence the final social mobility outcomes of individuals, by which I mean how through who they're hiring, through how they're progressing in the roles that they're going into, but also where they set up their businesses. They have a direct role in leveling up, the types of jobs they create locally, and what they choose to outsource, and as I said, who they actually recruit. We need employers to collect data, and I know we'll talk more about that later on. And we need employers to consider the routes into their organisation. Are they genuinely open to people from all backgrounds, or in some of their routes, are they more biased towards particular groups? And that's not just about the recruitment selection, it's about how they're promoting the roles that are open to them. Employers have got a much wider sphere of influence as well, beyond their own workforce. So thinking about their supplier networks, how can they influence their suppliers to do more? How can they do more within their industry sector, their clients and their customers? And what can they do in their local communities and beyond? So can they be doing more in schools to close some of these gaps that I mentioned, or to deepen the talent pools that they and others in their sector can fish from?
Brilliant. Thank you, John, and thank you also for mentioning data, which leads on to the next question. So Anne, you mentioned your CMI's Everyone Economy report that you've recently published. So one of the facts that came, some of the stats that came out of that report, that it discovered low levels of transparency in terms of data collection and reporting. So with 80% of respondents saying their organisations either did not capture socioeconomic background data of applicants during the recruitment process, or they didn't know if their organisations collected this data. So I just wanted a bit of a question on data. So why is it important for you that organisations should be collecting the data? And what are the best methods for collecting the data, and then what should be done with the data?
Well, yeah, that's a very important question and a real sticking point for a lot of organizations. I talk to a lot of managers and leaders across the board who say, we don't have that data. And we're really uncomfortable about collecting the data because, we can't force people, and it's uncomfortable for us. We can't necessarily see this, and it's awkward for us to ask people. And so I just want to spend some time discussing that. First of all, without the data, you're really not going to get anywhere. Okay. We need to start to collect data on all of these protected characteristics, including socioeconomic background, disability, things that might not always be visible. Why? Because that's our starting point. What gets measured gets managed. We can take a look at the data in various departments and various levels, and we can really get a snapshot of how our organizations perform. So it's very important that you do collect this data. So how do you do that? Because again, that hesitancy of, oh my goodness, people won't share. Well, our experience, and this is borne out by others, is a couple of things. First, you need to ask the right questions. Now, very fortunately, the Social Mobility Commission has done a lot of work on this, and in the toolkit you mentioned, there is the right question to ask, and it is, what was the occupation of your main household earner when you were about 14? That's the main question that employers should be asking. But of course, you can analyze the answer by how they respond. You can group people. Are they from professional backgrounds, intermediate backgrounds, lower working class backgrounds, other, or prefer not to say? So you can give the right range of options. When you're saying to people, I would like you to fill out this data, I would like you to provide me with this information, be really clear that why you want the data. That's actually a vital step, because what we know is when you're clear with your workforce, we want this data because we're trying to figure out what percentage of our workforce comes from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, how they're getting on, so that we can do something about it, because we want to get better in this space. We want to create an action plan. And in order to do that, we have to know what our starting point is. But don't just look at that quantitative data. Once you have that, it's so important for especially senior managers and leaders, but really everybody, to understand the lived experience. I mean, one of the things we did in the Everyone Economy is get people on camera sharing their experience of what it's like to come from a lower socioeconomic background and be excluded. It's so important that people understand the prejudices that people are facing every day in their working lives because of their backgrounds. So it isn't only quantitative, it's understanding the stories and the qualitative data behind the numbers. And remember, getting the data is only the first step. Once you have it, I go back to my say-do gap, do something with it. You have to put together a plan. Preferably, you will involve your employees in creating that plan, including people from
Hi, Anne. We slightly lost you there, but we'll see. We can't hear you, but we'll just thank you for that answer. It's very pertinent, particularly around employers being a bit hesitant. So, John, I wonder if you wanted to follow up on that data question, just thinking about what would the SMC suggest around data?
Thank you, Edward. And yeah, I think I missed the last 10 seconds or so of Anne's comments there, but really, really valuable. I just want to build on some of the things that Anne said there, because I think it's some great advice. Particularly what gets measured gets managed. Yeah, that was certainly my experience in the corporate world as well. And if we don't have data, then how can we start? When we think about gender representation and some of the progress that's been made there, and indeed identifying the gender pay gap, and obviously there's so much more that needs to be done in both of those areas. But if we weren't measuring it, we wouldn't know the scale of the challenge, or be able to track the progress that's been made there. And the same is true with socioeconomic background. So data is important for all the reasons that Anne mentioned. We have got a report that we can hopefully share a link to that looks at what you can measure. And as Anne mentioned, measuring or asking the key question about parental occupation of the main household earner when you're about 14 is the one that we recommend for various reasons. There are a couple of supplementary questions which you can ask too, if you feel able to, but that parental occupation is the most important one. And when you've asked the question, it's also important to be thinking about benchmarks. So you might find that a particular proportion of your employees or your recruits are from working class backgrounds or from professional backgrounds. But it's then important to put that into context and think, well, how does that compare to the country as a whole, or the working age population as a whole? And perhaps there might be some specialist areas that you're recruiting into that mean that you need particular skill sets or whatever. And there might be a different benchmark that you want to look at least in the interim, to compare your data to. And then, Anne mentioned an action plan, which I think is really, really important, but trying to sort of commit to the steps that you're going to take over the next few years, and to track that data over time, and to look at trying to close gaps towards those benchmarks, and not just looking as well at data across the whole organization, but looking at it at different levels of seniority as well. So there are some big firms have actually been very transparent in publishing this and showing where they may have more progress to make at a senior level, and there might be greater pay gap levels at higher levels of seniority. So I think looking at that is really, really important too.
Brilliant. Thank you, John, for bringing that out. And I just want to bring Anne back in, just check that we can hear you correctly. So the next question, Anne, is for you. It's around the role of senior leaders and managers in boosting inclusion and widening access of opportunities from those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. So from your perspective of CMI, who would you say is responsible for this within an organization, and what can leaders do on this agenda, and how can they build trust with their workforce?
Yes, and sorry, I think I may have cut out there briefly. I did get a flag that my internet was unstable. I hope it's okay now. Can you hear me again? Okay, good. So again, this is one of those really important points. So many organizations, when you ask, so who's responsible for boosting any kind of inclusion, including that of people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, will say, oh, we've got that covered. We have an ED&I specialist that works, into the CHRO, and that they're on it. But no, that's not good enough. I'm sorry, because it's not just that person's job. It's your job. It's every senior manager and leader, and indeed every middle manager and leader in the organization. It's your job as a manager and leader to be the main proponent of and arbiter of inclusivity for people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds in your team. So please don't just say it's the EDI guys, it's you. And you'll reap those business rewards I mentioned at the beginning. If you have a more diverse team, you're going to get more innovation, you're going to get better outcomes. So it's in your interest as a manager and leader to look around your own table and say, let me understand more about the makeup of my own team. And indeed, if you run a department, the makeup of my own department, and take responsibility and get under those lived experiences, that qualitative learning that may have got cut off from my last answer. So how do you do that as a manager? Well, we like to say it's about the 4 C's. And we did a piece of research that said, what really matters to inspire trust? And it's not rocket science. It's clarity, it's connection, collaboration, and compassion. And if you demonstrate that to your team, and if you're sensitive, that means you're maybe not asking people to reveal sensitive things in team meetings that might make them uncomfortable, but you're taking them aside and having, a more one-to-one personal discussion, perhaps over a cup of coffee, and just saying, tell me about your background, I'm interested, and you'll learn things about your own team. And then once you understand, then you can use those experiences in helping to formulate your own action plan, and even understand your own team and how they benchmark versus other teams in the organization. And if another team is much better than yours, go talk to that leader and find out what they're doing, right? So this is something that's a really important part of everybody's role, and that's one of the main outcomes of the everyone economy. It's not just the EDI guys, it's you.
Brilliant, thank you. And I think we'll be taking the 4Cs back with us. And it's very pertinent you mentioned, actually, it's not just the responsibility of the equality and diversity leads, it's actually the responsibility of all managers within an organization. So just looking at the next question, Anne, you have touched on this previously. I just wanted to talk to you around progression. So one of the points we know is that thinking about socio-economic diversity and inclusion within a workforce, it's not just about who gets into that workforce, it's also about who gets on and what happens with individuals within an organization. So I just thought I'd ask you a question around what role does training play, particularly on the job training in progressing individuals within organizations, and how can organizations support all staff to access training to develop themselves and so they can have access to opportunities?
Well, it's a really important point, and so is the progression point, because what's true about many of these protected characteristics, including socioeconomic background, not a protected characteristic, but certainly a marginalized one, people often say to me, well, it's fine, I've recruited a bunch of people, from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, we're fine. But believe me, you are not fine, because unless you train and develop those people, and unless you promote those people, they will leave and you'll be right back where you started from. And, I encourage, and this is something that we took from the gender pay gap, and I was on the original government advisory committee. I really encourage people to look not only at their recruitment, but at their progression in quartiles. So, cut your organization, however big it is, into 4 quartiles and track the progress of people moving from the lower to the next, and the next to the next, and the 3rd quartile to the top. And I guarantee you're going to find you have more in the bottom than you do at the top. And this is what you're trying to address. And training and development are absolutely essential if you are going to bring people through. Now, there are things that you can do to help this. And, many of these we do a lot of at CMI. One thing is apprenticeships, for example. Now, what's really interesting about management apprenticeships, if I go back to that key question, what were your parents doing age 14? Well, 71% of management apprentices have parents that did not go to university. And almost 40% of management apprentices come from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. That's a great mobility tool, because you're helping them get into management and leadership. Other things that can help are coaching and sponsorship programs. These are all very important, and indeed access to other development programs, including, and I have to do a plug here, chartered status. One of the things we know about chartered status is those managers and leaders that qualify for chartered status boost their earnings by an average of 13,000 pounds. And they also add up to 60,000 pounds a year to their organization. So they are really giving back. So allowing people to have professional qualifications and getting them chartered is a great way of developing people and indeed boosting their confidence. So do train and develop people. And by the way, the other thing I love is once you train and develop people, they're so much more likely to train and develop their people. It's like a pay it forward thing. They understand the value to them and they say, well, that was fabulous. I'm going to train and develop my team. So there's a lot that employers can do to make a really big difference here.
Brilliant, thank you, Anne. That was great, and particularly thinking around the quartiles and how it's done similar with gender pay gap and looking at the quartiles within an organisation. John, I don't know if you want to come in there, just thinking about progression and what SMC's advice would be on that.
Thanks, Edward. Yeah, I think very similar themes. So focusing on developing that culture of progression within an organization, and I don't just mean that from a social mobility perspective, but having that across the organization is really important to allow all to progress, but it can also remove some of the barriers that are specifically there for those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, perhaps. I think training is very important within that, and also holding regular career conversations with your team. I know within the SMC and indeed the Cabinet Office, it is part of sort of a monthly catch up that you have where you with each of the people you line manage, where you talk about training and about longer term aspirations and so on. I think my views are also informed by some work we did at Outreach. So at Outreach, we supported students from less advantaged backgrounds to get into graduate jobs, but we also ran an alumni program for them. And we actually did a survey of the alumni earlier this year where we asked them what's good, what's bad about the organizations that you're working in. What are they doing that is helpful, and what are some of the barriers to your progression within the organizations that you're at? And there were some great examples of good practice, but there were also some situations where perhaps they felt they'd been sold a very diverse and very progressive organization, but the reality once they actually arrived was quite different. And I think some of the things that we were told were important were things like employee networks, to help provide people with role models and support. I think, and this is true of some of the SMC work that's been done in this space too as well, is thinking about having transparency of promotion and pay. So often being very explicit about what is actually needed to get to the next level, and what and likewise about pay and the levels up. So you tend to see more mobility from an income perspective if that is clear, and there are some professions like teaching, for example, where it is very clear, certainly at the more junior ranks, but less so in the corporate world. And providing more stepping stones of responsibility so that they're not quite so big jumps. And there are other things like reverse mentoring, which have been shown to be helpful, and shadowing, so that people can be shadowing people at a more senior level, to help them understand what it takes to get there. So I think all of those things can be important.
Brilliant, thank you, John. That was very useful. So just Anne, moving on to you, just thinking about a question on hiring and recruitment. So obviously leaders and managers have quite a large function in the hiring process, and one of the things we do know that many common hiring practices can create artificial barriers for people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. So Anne, what initial steps would you suggest that all organizations should take to remove some of those barriers if they do have them in the recruitment process?
Yeah, it's another great question. So the good news is there's a lot you can do, and some of it has been aided and abetted by some of the developments and the pandemic, like this one. We're all on a Zoom call, so you're not as tied geographically to where you recruit talent. And that's my first thing. Where are you recruiting? So many organizations, particularly corporates do the same old. They go to the top universities and they hire their next intake. Don't do that. You'll never get a diverse workforce if you do that. You have to look broader. So recruit in places, whether that's FE colleges, whether that's different cities where you don't normally recruit, that are very diverse, whether that's poorer parts of the country, right? This is all available information to you. And so talent comes talent is everywhere. Look for it. If you don't look in different places, you're not going to get different diverse talent. So that's the first thing, where you look. The second thing is how you look. Again, if you only take graduates and they only have Russell Group universities on their CVs, don't be surprised if you're not going to get a hugely diverse workforce, or you're not going to get people from disadvantaged socioeconomic backgrounds. You should consider blind CVs, and you should definitely consider non-degree students. There are some incredibly successful people that never went to university. Maybe they went into a trade, maybe they went into did an apprenticeship. Don't exclude those people from when you are screening your applicants. And then the third thing is who is interviewing and hiring these people? Because again, the research shows that if you do not have a diverse interview panel, it doesn't help that you have a diverse selection of applicants. The research says they're not going to get hired. We're human. We like to hire in our own image. And that's another bias we have to overcome. So not only do you need diverse hiring panels, you need structured interview questions. You can't leave people to ask whatever questions they want. You have to ask structured questions so you can actually see how is the candidate answering the same question that you put to every single candidate. So you can compare and contrast. Otherwise, what so often happens, in an interview, somebody will have a like-minded chat with a like-minded individual that reminds them of themselves, and they'll get hired, even though they may not be at all the best qualified candidate, and they certainly won't be the most diverse in most cases. So, where you look, how you look, and who's helping you to do that hiring, and what they're asking, all of these things are incredibly important.
Thank you, Anne. And yeah, your point around qualifications is particularly critical. So thinking about an organisation, is this qualification necessary for the specific role that they're advertising? So if we just move on to the next question. So just wanted to ask both Anne and John, so we'll start with Anne. What advice would you give to those in today's session whose organisations aren't yet focused on socio-economic diversity and inclusion within their organisations? So what advice would you give on actions they can take to encourage this within their organisation?
Well, simply put, I'd say do everything we've been discussing for the last 40 minutes. But just to remind you what that is. So it starts with recognizing that you probably have a problem here. We're missing 420,000 leaders and managers from lower socioeconomic backgrounds relative to the working population in the country. So there's quite a big problem. So that's the first step. Don't fall into the say-do gap. I bet your annual report or your hangings on the wall say you're a wonderful and inclusive place for people from everywhere, including from socioeconomic backgrounds. But remember the say-do gap. Okay, you have that hanging on the wall, but what are you doing? Where are the programs? Maybe they don't exist. The third is get the data, right? Start somewhere. Ask that key question that is in your toolkit about what their parents were doing. Start to look at it and break it down by quartile, break it down by function, break it down by geographic area, and then benchmark versus perhaps others in your area or others in your sector, and get an idea of where you are. And then start to look at your recruitment practices, right? What we said about where you look, how you look, what you look for, who's doing the looking, and make sure that's really inclusive and looking at these, not putting up barriers to these characteristics. And finally, your promotion. That's so important because so many organizations think it's, they've hired, they're done. They are so not done because those people will leave. We see it all the time unless you help them to get on and progress through things like training, things like chartered, things like reverse mentoring that John mentioned. So, the good news is there's so much you can do that you really can make huge progress. once you commit yourself to making those huge taking those steps. And my last point is what I said. Remember, it is your job as a manager and leader. Please, it's not just the hardworking equality and diversity team, and they will welcome your support because that's what they need. They need you as the line manager and leader to take responsibility and accountability in your organization to make a difference on this issue. And you can start today.
Thank you, Anne. We'll definitely, the say-do gap is the phrase for today's session that we'll be taking that forward. John, I don't know if you wanted to come in there.
Very quickly, because I know there's some great questions as well that would be good to have time to answer. I think, yeah, first of all, it's important to engage others in your organization. Often I hear of firms that start to build a social mobility network and are amazed by how many people who really wanted to work in this space and to contribute. I think it's important to try to get senior leader buy-in and to be making not just the moral case of fairness, but also the business case, and to make sure that that's well understood. On the say-do gap, I think it can be quite frustrating sometimes when you see the amount firms invest in PR rather than actually making a difference. Things like the social mobility pledge are useless unless you're actually doing something tangible. So don't sign a pledge, actually make tangible change within your organization. You hear of firms, literally PR firms, that will charge £15,000 linked to the pledge for a photo with a former MP, for you to have some positive PR coverage with a diverse looking photograph. That just doesn't cut it anymore. You'll get pushback from your teams if you aren't actually making change within your organization. So really do stuff, not just PR. I think we've spoken a lot about what that stuff is. It's about thinking about recruitment, about progression, data, all those kinds of things are important. I think the outreach work is important too, both in terms of trying to attract people into your organization who maybe haven't considered applying to join, and helping them to develop the skills and experiences that enable them to make a good application. And lastly, you're thinking about the work in your community as well. So it's not just about recruitment in, it's about, as I said before, the suppliers, your clients and customers, and also what you can do in your local communities to make a difference.
Brilliant. Thank you, John. And we'll move on to the audience Q&A. So if you do have any questions, please pop them in the Q&A chat box. We'll just go through some of the questions. So Anne, this is just on the say-do gap. So we've had a question come in on the say-do gap, and it was just asking what are some of the most effective action that you have personally seen that an organization has taken to promote those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, or you could use any other characteristic as well.
Well, there's a lot. I think the thing to remember is there is no silver bullet, and organizations that are successful do a number of the things that we've talked about here. They do get the data. The senior leadership is committed, but also holds everybody throughout the organization to account. They do have role models. And so like a senior leader talking about, I grew up in poverty and it was very hard for me, but here's, how I did that, and you can do that too. Reaching out and sponsoring people, understanding the barriers they may face, making sure again that you do have that transparency that we talked about how you recruit and how you promote. So many organizations have, very opaque rules about who gets ahead. That's very off-putting to people from disadvantaged backgrounds. And I am a big proponent of setting targets. What I said, what gets measured gets managed. If you want progress in all of these areas, then set targets in all of these areas, and help employees to connect. Employee resource groups are a great asset as well for encouraging sharing of stories, finding of sponsors. So I wish I could say, just do this one thing, but I can't. There is no silver bullet, and it takes time. And you have to know that it takes time and commit for the longer haul, and say, right, it might take us 5 years, but we're going to change this.
Brilliant. Thank you, Anne. And we'll just, we've had a kind of link to that. We've had a question in just come in saying, how do we progress this without the deficit model? So as someone from a lower socioeconomic background, many actions are train them, but I'm already well experienced and accredited. I don't need more training in leadership and management. So is there a kind of, picking up from the question, is there a risk that despite formal training, people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds are not selected for special projects or career tracks or roles and other such opportunities? So Anne, I don't know if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, and also a tip. It's a great point, and it's about this progression opportunity. Who gets the opportunities? So there are two things that you can do, and these are real examples. One is, so organizations that start with people, some organizations start with reviewing people from diverse backgrounds first when it comes to promotion opportunities. They actually start with those people, look at them. Are they qualified for the stretch opportunity? Of course, you know, many of them will be. So you do those first, right? Rather than, you know, starting with the usual suspects or the people that might look like the senior managers the most. So that's a really good way of encouraging that people do get their fair chance and get their experience heard, focusing on performance outcomes rather than things like FaceTime or whether or not you hang out at the pub with the boss is very important here. And I like to encourage people to keep their own achievement log, you know, which is just keep a log of what you've achieved, and be your own advocate. You know, if you have exceeded your objectives, and I'm sure the person who said they're very well qualified but just excluded gets that, you know, has done very well, then keep a log of it and then go see your boss, make an appointment and say, I'd like to discuss my career progression with you. And then go through your achievement log. You know, I've achieved this project, you know, X% ahead of time and Y% under budget with Z results. I'd like to discuss my pathway to promotion across the next 6 months, and agree that with you. You know, have that discussion proactively, and relative to that, get a sponsor, right? If you have a great achievement log, then a person who is the most senior person in your line would be a great sponsor for you. Because you'll get on their radar. They will give you access to their networks. They will give you access to wider opportunities, special projects that will develop you. And, you know, I like to say that women are over mentored and under sponsored. It's true. And people from diverse socioeconomic backgrounds, you know, are over allied and under sponsored, right? You know, again, it's about giving access to the opportunities. I think executive teams that are held to account to sponsor people from diverse characteristics are great role models, and they tend to make better and faster progress. It's all part of, you know, this is everybody's job, and it's all about a better business case.
Brilliant, thank you, Anne. And just looking at the next questions on data. So John, I don't know if you want to come in on this one. So we've had a question in saying, data is often asked, so the data on socioeconomic background is often asked at the end of a people survey in many organizations. Do you think this is the best approach, and what are the best approaches to collecting data and information?
Thanks, Edward. I think there are some resources we can share on our website which go into this in a bit more detail, but I think in the ideal world, you'd be collecting that data when someone joins, because it is, if you're talking about parental occupation, for example, at age 14, or indeed the school that you went to, it is fixed data that doesn't sort of change after you've joined. So if it can be collected when people join, then it's already part of an employment record and or part of the data that they have on you. And it then doesn't need to be at the end of a survey where you have those concerns about an anonymity. So I think there's lots of learnings that we can share from other organizations about how they've gone about it. And it is quite hard to get that response rate up, but firms that have persevered over a number of years have managed to get that response rate up to be very high, to be very meaningful for the data it's producing. So recognizing there are some challenges there, but that it is important to try multiple ways, whether it's when they're joining or indeed at the end of year survey that people are completing. I think the last thing I'd say is just making sure that it's clear, first of all, that it is anonymous, assuming that it is, and that won't be used in any individual discussions. It's for looking at the overall organization, and making it clear that is how it's being used. It's not being used for individual decisions.
Thank you, John. And then just moving on to, we've had a question in on, so for Anne, on employer resource groups. So the question is, do you think it's important to have employer resource groups that are focused on social mobility and socio-economic background? And what do you see their role within organizations? What should their role be?
Yes, I do think it's important. And I think organizations that have inclusive cultures tend to have employee network groups and resource groups, and they're made up of not only people who come from the protected characteristics, but also from people who want to learn more about, how to interact with, be comfortable with, recognize, promote, and, be an ally for people with diverse characteristics. And one of the great examples, I think, is our last year's gold medal winner was Allison Rose of NatWest Bank, and they have all of these groups active in NatWest. And Allison herself meets with the leaders from each of the groups on a regular basis, and they share their progress, they share their setbacks, they share their stories. And that makes her so much more aware as CEO of what the issues and challenges are, and also what the bright spots and what the progress is. So I think those groups can be a great resource, and also they provide psychological safety and give people the feeling that they're not alone, and there are other people like themselves, and that's a very important part of helping people feel included at work. So yeah, I think they have a very important role to play. Again, like Allison, the CEO, you have to take them seriously. I think there are employers that just have these groups, and I'll quote something that was quite upsetting to me in some work on gender that was shared with me by a woman who was leading the gender network for her employer. And her boss said to her, "Oh yeah, that thing you do, that diversity thing, nobody cares." Please do not be one of those employers. If you're having these resource groups, take them seriously, listen to their contributions, learn from them.
Brilliant. Thank you. And I think we've just got a few minutes left, so we'll just maybe final question. And it was just, again, going back to the phrase of the day, the say-do gap. So the question was around, is there anything else you could do to bridge the gap? And what is the best way to bridge that gap? So we'll go to Anne, and then that will be the final question.
Well, again, this is about what gets measured, gets managed, and there are different ways of doing that. I think transparency around exposing it is very important. And I really think John referenced this as well. You can't just have the PR. That is the worst part of the say-do gap. And again, one of my favorite examples is, and again, we could do this because of the data, you know, the gender pay gap that organizations have to publish, there was a bot on Twitter, and every time an organization tweeted how fabulous they were at gender inclusivity, the bot tweeted their gender pay gap. And, you know, there was the Say Do Gap in action, right? All of these, you know, big organizations in sectors like financial services or technology or wherever saying, of course, we take inclusivity very important and we're huge champions of gender equality. And then the bot would tweet that they had like a 60% gender pay gap in favor of men, you know. So really, it's about knowing where you stand, right? And don't fall into that trap of allowing your senior leaders or your marketing departments or your annual report people to claim stuff that isn't backed up by your reality and by the programs in your organization. And again, that's your responsibility. And I would raise it with the CEO. You know, we say this in the annual report. What are we doing about it?
Brilliant, thank you. And we're just short of time, so I think we'll have to wrap up there. But I just want to thank you both, Anne and John. That was excellent. Some of the points covered in there, especially some of the phrases as well, we're taking forward. So thank you both for joining today's session.
Thank you so much. And I enjoyed it, and it's a great toolkit. We've endorsed it. I highly recommend it.
Brilliant. And yes, thank you very much for that as well. So we just got one final slide. So we're just looking at some of our upcoming events coming up. So we've got a session on T-levels, which is on the 29th of November. So that's our next event. So that's going to be hosted by our Deputy Chair and Principal of Oldham College, so Ann Francke. So we want to look into T-levels, why they're good for social mobility, and how they can support employers to get early access to talented people. So if you are interested in that, please pop along to our website and you can sign up for that on our website. And then finally, just on our website, we have other resources available. So obviously we discussed the Building Blocks Toolkit today, but we've got a Cross Industries Toolkit, and then other resources for organizations. So no matter where you are in the journey, please do access them. You can download them. But yes, once again, thank you to Anne and John. That was an excellent session. And also, can I thank everyone for joining today as well. I hope you've all found it useful, and we'll be back shortly. Thank you so much, everybody.